I've been doing some study recently on some major heresies regarding the person of Jesus Christ. And some of them I'm very familiar with, and some of them I was like, oh, this is a twist on this. And it had been a while since I'd read on them. I had to refresh my thinking on some of these. And one of those I thought I knew. And then as I continued to work on it, I was thinking, well, this sounds actually biblical. And I'm thinking, is my thinking wrong? And did these people get this wrong? I want to talk a little bit about this here today. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're just doing a Bible study today, kind of a short Bible study on an aspect of who God the Son is, or Jesus Christ. And among these heresies, there's a number of things. There's people that believe that the Jesus they saw on this earth just appeared to be a man but wasn't a man. That was Docetism and other versions of that at that time. And that was actually very early on. That, in fact, I believe that was going on while the New Testament was being written, and I believe John addresses that in 1 John. There's also another heresy that believes that Jesus wasn't God and that he was a created being and that God created him and made him his son in a different way. And that was a doctrine that came in a little over 200 years after the time of Christ. Probably was coming in earlier than that. It's just that it came to a head and had to be dealt with among the churches at that time. And then there was a man by the name of Nestorius. And Nestorius we're in the late 300s, early 400s now. So we're looking at from the time that Christ left the earth, or even the time that the New Testament closed, we're looking at this time almost 300 years after the time the New Testament closes, and getting closer to 400 years from the time that Jesus Christ left the earth. And Nestorius was very concerned because he was a bishop. That's what they called him. People today, you call me a pastor, but in their days they called a person that filled this office a bishop. Meant that they were an overseer. And he was an overseer in what we know today as Constantinople, or as we know as Istanbul. It was Constantinople. Before that, it was Byzantium. But it's the same city up on the Bosporus up there in northern Turkey. And Nestorius was really concerned because there were people that were beginning to refer to Mary. And by Mary, I mean Mary, the mother of the humanity, of the Son. They began to refer to Mary as Theotokos, God bearer, came to be popularized as Mary, Mother of God. That's not initially the way it was framed, but it had a similar idea to it. And the problem was, it was very popular with the people. And when I say the people, we're not talking about the bishops or the pastors of the churches, although it was popular among some of them. It was very, very popular among the people. And that doesn't surprise me, because people have a tendency to deify people that they really like. I mean, we live in a culture where they almost treat some sports celebrities and such as though they're gods, and they bow the knee to these individuals. And it's just one little example of how the fact we have a tendency to deify people. But even more so when you are having a religious idea, and there was religious things that were associated with Mary, because, well, didn't she give birth to Jesus? And so from that ended up things coming out of that eventually, that Mary had to be protected from the taint of sin. So she was also sin-free, but I think I mentioned this in a brief comment the other day. If you do that, well, then where do you go? Was her mom sin-free and her mom sin-free, and so on and so forth. And we even, and I grew up being taught this, that the sin nature is passed on through the father, not through the mother. That's how Jesus was protected. But the Bible doesn't teach that. That's a theological, philosophical construct to try to figure out how to make Jesus protected from the taint of sin, taint of the sin nature. And we looked at that just the other day in a study, that's the Holy Spirit's work, was protecting him so that wasn't passed on from Mary. But he did get real genetic material, and really then was born literally Mary's son. Like I said, I don't know, did his eyes look a little bit like that? But all of that aside, what ended up, Nestorius was very concerned with this, and he says we can't refer to Mary as this, because what she did was she gave birth to, we put it in our modern language, to the human nature, the humanity of the Son. She didn't give birth to God. Because if she gave birth to God, that meant she also had to give birth to, because they believe in the Trinity, they had to give birth to the Father and to the Spirit too. Yeah, Nestorius understood the Trinity. And so this conflict then rose up, and people got very upset with him. And he said, no, he says the Son is one person with two natures. Now, what ends up happening when you read about this in church history, frequently they're going to say Nestorius taught that there were two persons. But if you read Nestorius's writings, he says, no, you're misunderstanding me. There's one person, and he has two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. This is what Nestorius was trying to say. And Nestorius ended up going down because there was a more popular, it was a political move is what it was. And there was a very, very popular preacher that came out of Egypt, and he manipulated things, situations, and he ended up getting Nestorius ousted. And of course, along with his ousting was this castigation that Nestorius was teaching all this really horrible bad doctrine, and teaching really that there was a human person and a God person. But no, God the Son is one person, but he has two desirous wills, two natures with two desirous wills. And we can see one example of that here in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 39. And he went a little beyond them, fell on his face, and prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. By the way, the cup, when you study this out, the cup is not that he doesn't want to die. We know that because in John 12 he says, I came for this very purpose, so I'm not going to ask you for that. So this cup is not about this. We're not going to talk about what the cup is right now, maybe another day. Yet, not as I will. And this word will is the word thelo, meaning not as I desire. Meaning in my human nature. He's not saying that I'm just a human person and I'm not divine. But he's saying this desire that I have, that's part of me, especially with regard to my human nature, this desirous will is in conflict with as you. And they've added the word will here, but over here we have the adverb hos and you, not but as you would will, not as I. And both of these are nominative in the Greek, meaning they're the subject of the sentence. Not, there's a subject, I, and then will. So then here's another subject, but there's no verb. It's a verbless clause, but as you will. So he's saying that there's a conflict between the will that he had and the will of the Father. And you'd say, well, wait a second. I thought they're one God. They are one God. But his human nature has a desire that is different from even what the divine nature desires. Okay, but he makes the choice. He is a person, he has, separate from just his, we have over here this thelo, this desirous will, he also has a determination. And that goes with who he is as a person. So he's going to choose to operate here or operate over here. This is what he's going to choose to do. And what he chooses is to do the will of the Father, the will that even he in his divine nature is in agreement on. There are two wills. We have another example of this in John chapter 4. Jesus and his disciples are passing through Samaria. And it says, so Jesus being wearied from the journey, and this word wearied means he's really exhausted of labor. The work of all the stuff that he'd been doing while he'd been down at the feast, number one. And number two, everything that had been taking place in traveling. So all of this, remember, there's all these crowds, all these people that are coming to him and talking to him all the time. And so he's wearied from this whole journey. And he sits in this way then at the well, and it's about the 6th hour. Now, apparently his disciples go into town, and if you know the story, the Samaritan woman comes out to talk to him. And when, I'm just going to switch over to this one, there's a point after this conversation has really come to its point, verse 40 or verse 27. At this point, his disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman, number one. And yet no one said, what do you seek, or why are you speak with her? So the woman left, and she returns. after she's gone, verse 31, meanwhile the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, or Master, eat. Apparently this is part of the reason he was tired. Probably hadn't taken time to eat, so they get him some food to sustain him, to refresh him. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples were saying to one another, well, no one brought him anything to eat, did they? Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me, and to accomplish or complete his work. He was wearied from the journey, but the minute it was time to engage with the Samaritan woman and talk to her about things that clearly, as a human, in his human nature, he did not know. He did not know that she'd been with 5 men. The one she was with now was not her husband. He didn't know that in his human nature. But that's something in his divine omniscience he does know. See, he's got these 2 natures that he can move in. And in a human nature, he can be exhausted and tired and need to stop and sit at the well while his disciples get food. But in his divine nature, when it's time to step up and do something, his divine nature can step and engage this woman in communication with her that is going to amaze her. It's going to convince her he is the Messiah. He's the anointed one, the one anointed to be Israel's king. And so he says down here in verse 34, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. See, he has 2 natures. He has this human nature that has weaknesses and frailties, is tired and becomes hungry, and the divine nature that does not weary itself. I was just reading some sections in Isaiah last night, and where it says God does not weary, he does not become tired. That's contrary to the nature of God, to become exhausted or wearied. If God stopped creating in Genesis when he was creating the world, it wasn't because he was tired. It's just because he stopped creating. That's what the Sabbat meant. It just meant cessation. He wasn't doing it because he was tired after a week of hard work. That's not what it was. So God the Son has 2 natures, and Nestorius was right. One person with 2 natures. And when you read the Gospels, boy, when I came to understand this, the Gospels just made so much more sense, because there were all these times I was thinking, well, how come over here he seems to be like he doesn't know, or he's asking these questions that he doesn't seem to be asking him to engage people. He seems to be asking people because there's a legitimate question on this thing. And then all of a sudden over here he demonstrates something as God. And how do those work? And coming to understand that he moves between these 2 natures. He uses qualities from those as is the will of the Father. Whatever the Father desired, he would do. He didn't rely on who he was in his divine nature unless it was the Father's will. Otherwise, he relied on the ministry of the Spirit in his humanity, like we do. Not exactly the same, but similar, just similar examples. And all of this, then, for us to understand, here's a man that is deemed a heretic, is ousted from the church, and yet, granted, there were people down the road that took things that he taught and said, yeah, 2 persons. That's what they ran with. But that is not what he taught. He taught what is biblical, which, interestingly enough, in not very many years after this, the Council of Chalcedon is going to agree with exactly what Nestorius was teaching and affirmed. And why did they have a problem with it in the first place? Was it really that they thought he taught 2 persons? Or was it because they were so enamored with worshiping and idolizing, deifying Mary? And I may be using some terms in an anachronistic way, but you get the idea, because they weren't doing all of those things yet, but some of those people were. People have a tendency to do this. And because they were so enamored with her, instead of focusing on the one that actually deserved the real worship and the real respect, that they put it over here, and they denied, they did not frame accurately who Jesus Christ really was. So that there are many Christians to this day that do not understand the idea of these 2 natures and how they work, how they cooperate, because they're not persons. They're just the natures that this one person has, and how he uses and moves between those, even to this day. Even to this day, he has qualities that are related to a human nature, sits on a throne in a physical body with scars that he displayed to his disciples, and divine nature that is present everywhere, is never confined to a physical location, has no body, and has no scars. He moves in both. And I think that this is very important for us to understand and appreciate the nature of God the Son, the one that was able to be God, but come down here and become a man so that he could die on a cross in our place for our sins, to be buried and to rise again. And I trust that that is something that you hold, that you believe, and that you know you're forgiven because of what he's done, and only because of what he's done. And with that, I encourage you to have a good day in the Lord, and I thank you for joining me.